The mountain hadn't seen a stranger in 3 winters. Ezra Colton liked it that way. He was 71 years old, built like an old fence post, narrow, weathered, and still standing after everything that should have knocked him down. His hands were thick with scars nobody asked about anymore. His beard had gone the color of ash. He lived alone at the top of Miller's Ridge, in a cabin his father built and his son never came back to see. The town below called him the Mountain Man. Not always kindly. Nobody in Larkspur Hollow could remember the last time Ezra Colton accepted a dinner invitation. Or a church visit. Or even a wave that lasted longer than a second. He kept 3 dogs, a mule named Samson, and a rifle he hadn't fired at anything but coyotes in 11 years. That was the whole of his world. And he had built it that way on purpose. The knock came just after sundown, in the cold hush of late October, when the wind off the ridge cut through with smoke and pine. Ezra was cleaning a lantern glass at his table when the dogs started barking. Not the bark they gave for deer. Not the bark they gave for coyotes either. He set the glass down slow, listening. 3 sharp knocks. Then nothing. He opened the door with the rifle loose in one hand, more habit than fear. Nobody stood on the porch. He stepped out into the cold, boots crunching against frost-hardened dirt, eyes moving across the dark tree line. The wind pushed through the pines like something breathing. Then he heard it. A small sound. Barely a sound at all. Crying. Coming from behind the woodpile. Ezra found the boy curled against the stacked logs, knees pulled to his chest, shivering hard enough that his teeth clicked together. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old. No coat. 1 shoe missing. A thin scratch running along his cheek, not deep, but red against the pale skin. "Hey now," Ezra said, keeping his voice low, the way he used to gentle a spooked horse. "Hey now. Nobody's gonna hurt you." The boy flinched anyway. Ezra crouched down slow, joints protesting, and held out one open hand, the way he'd hold it out to Samson when the mule was scared of thunder. "You got a name?" The boy didn't answer. Just stared at him with eyes too old for his face, the kind of eyes that had already learned the world wasn't safe. Ezra didn't push. He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around the small shaking shoulders instead, wool still warm from the fire. "Well," he said. "Guess that can wait." He carried the boy inside. The boy wouldn't eat at first. Sat by the fire wrapped in a wool blanket 2 sizes too big, staring at the flames like they might disappear if he looked away. Ezra didn't ask questions. He'd learned long ago that questions asked too soon just built walls higher. Instead, he ladled stew into a bowl and set it down within reach. Then he sat in his own chair across the room, working a piece of leather with his knife, giving the boy space to decide on his own terms. It was nearly an hour before the boy picked up the spoon. Ezra didn't look up. Didn't smile. Just kept cutting leather, letting the moment pass without weight. But something in his chest had shifted. Something he hadn't felt in years. By the time the fire burned low, the boy had fallen asleep sitting up, spoon still in his hand. Ezra eased it from his fingers and covered him properly with the blanket, careful the way a man is careful with something he's afraid to break. He studied the boy's face in the firelight. Dirt-streaked. Exhausted. Achingly familiar in a way Ezra couldn't yet place. Then he noticed the boy's shoe, the one he still had. Hand-stitched. Old-fashioned stitching, the kind nobody used anymore. Except one man. Ezra's own hands went still. He'd made shoes exactly like that once. A lifetime ago. For a boy who grew up and left the mountain and never came back. His son. Morning came gray and quiet, frost-thick on the window panes. Ezra was outside chopping wood when he heard the cabin door creak open behind him. The boy stood on the porch, blanket still wrapped around his shoulders, watching him with those same careful eyes. "You got somewhere you're headed?" Ezra asked, setting the axe down. The boy shook his head slowly. "You got someone looking for you?" Another shake. Smaller this time. Like the truth cost something to admit. Ezra studied him a long moment. The scratch on his cheek. The missing shoe. The stitching on the one he still wore. "What's your name, son?" The boy's chin trembled. For the first time, his voice came out, small, cracked, barely above the wind. "Danny." Ezra's breath caught in his throat. That had been his son's name too, once, the name he gave him before the boy grew old enough to hate the mountain, hate his father, hate everything Ezra Colton stood for. Danny Colton had walked off this ridge 15 years ago and never looked back. Ezra hadn't heard that name spoken aloud since. He knelt down slowly, ignoring the ache in his knees, bringing himself level with the boy's frightened eyes. "Danny," he repeated softly. "That's a fine name." The boy studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind his gaze, calculation, maybe, or hope, or simple exhaustion giving way to trust. Then he said the words that stopped the whole mountain from turning. "Are you gonna send me away?" Everybody else did. Ezra's throat tightened. He thought of every door he'd shut on the town below. Every neighbor he'd turned away over the years, every kindness refused, every hand he never shook. "No," he said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long while. "Nobody's sending you anywhere." The boy studied him a moment longer. Then, so quiet Ezra almost missed it beneath the wind. "Okay, Grandpa." Ezra Colton, who hadn't cried since his wife's funeral, who hadn't let a soul close enough to matter in 15 years, felt something crack open in his chest. He didn't correct the boy. He didn't ask what he meant by it. He just reached out and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, let someone else's hand rest inside his own. Behind them, deep in the tree line where the frost hadn't melted, a set of boot prints, adult-sized, moving fast, moving away, were already disappearing beneath the falling snow. Ezra didn't see the boot prints. Not that morning. He was too busy watching Danny's small hand disappear inside his own, too busy feeling the strange, aching warmth of it, to look toward the tree line where the snow was already erasing whatever had passed through in the night. He'd notice them later. And by then, it would matter more than he could have known. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them spoke about, but both seemed to need. Ezra cooked breakfast, eggs, and biscuits burned slightly on the bottom the way Danny, it turned out, actually preferred. Danny fed the dogs, dropping scraps to each one by name within 2 days, like he'd always belonged in this cabin, on this ridge, in this life. Ezra taught him how to stack wood so it wouldn't topple. Danny taught Ezra, without meaning to, how silence could hold two people instead of separating them. Neither one mentioned Danny's mother. Neither one mentioned Grandpa again either. The word just settled into the cabin's air, unspoken but understood, the way frost settles overnight and nobody questions where it came from. But Ezra watched him. Studied him the way he used to study weather rolling in over the ridge, reading the signs, waiting to see what was coming. The boy startled at loud sounds. Flinched when Ezra raised his voice even slightly, even in laughter. Ate fast, like the food might vanish if he didn't hurry. Ezra recognized those habits. He'd seen them in soldiers once, decades back. He'd seen a version of them in his own son, long before Danny, the first Danny, had packed a bag and walked off this mountain for good. He didn't ask. Not yet. But he started locking the door at night. Not to keep anyone out. To keep something in. The town found out on the 9th day. Ezra rode Samson down to Larkspur Hollow for supplies he didn't strictly need, the boy bundled in a coat 2 sizes too big, riding in front of him with both small hands gripping the saddle horn. Mabel Whitfield, who ran the general store and had tried for 6 years running to get Ezra to join her church supper, nearly dropped a crate of canned peaches when she saw them come through the door. "Ezra Colton," she said, staring at the boy like he might be a trick of the light. "Who in the world is this?" "Grandson," Ezra said, and the word came out steadier than he expected. Steadier than he had any right to say it, given how little he actually knew. Mabel's eyes narrowed, not unkindly, just sharp, the way a woman gets sharp when something doesn't add up. "Didn't know you had one." "Neither did I," Ezra admitted. "Till he showed up on my porch. That should have been the end of it. A strange story, a kind old man, a lost child taken in." But Mabel's face changed. Went pale under her freckles. "Ezra," she said slowly. "There's been a man asking round town. 2 days now. Asking after a missing boy." The cold that went through Ezra then had nothing to do with the weather. "What did he look like?" Mabel hesitated. "Rough. Angry, if I'm honest. Didn't sit right with me, the way he talked about the boy. Like he was talking about property, not a child." Behind Ezra, Danny had gone very still. Too still. His small hand found the back of Ezra's coat and gripped it tight, knuckles white. Ezra turned to look at him. And in the boy's eyes, he saw the answer before he even asked the question. "Danny," he said quietly. "You know who that man is?" The boy's chin trembled the way it had that first cold night. But this time, he didn't look away. He said if I ever told, Danny whispered, he'd make sure nobody ever came looking. Ezra didn't sleep that night. He sat in his chair by the fire with the rifle across his knees, listening to every creak of the cabin, every shift of wind against the shutters, while Danny slept curled in the bed that had once belonged to his own son. Around midnight, the dogs began to growl, low, warning growls, aimed at the tree line. Ezra rose without a sound and moved to the window. Nothing. Just darkness, and wind pushing through bare branches, and somewhere far off, an owl calling into the cold. But he'd lived on this mountain 71 years. He knew the difference between empty woods and woods that were watching back. He banked the fire low, checked the door twice, and sat back down where he could see both the window and the bed. He didn't close his eyes again until dawn. The truth came out 3 days later, in pieces, the way truth does when a child isn't ready to hand it over all at once. Danny's mother, Ezra's own daughter-in-law, a woman named Carol he'd met exactly once, at a wedding 15 years gone, had died the previous spring. Sickness, sudden and unkind. Danny had gone to live with his father. His father. Danny Colton. Ezra's son. The son Ezra hadn't spoken to since the day he left the mountain, calling his father a hard, cold, unforgiving man, words that had lodged in Ezra's chest like splinters too deep to dig out. That son had become, in the years since, someone even harder than the father he'd run from. Danny didn't say the word hit. He didn't have to. He said careful a lot. He said quiet a lot. He flinched at raised voices the way a boy flinches only when he's learned raised voices come before something worse. And 3 weeks ago, in a fit of fear more than planning, the boy had run. Walked for 2 days along the old logging road, following nothing but a half-remembered story his mother used to tell him, about a grandfather on a mountain, a stubborn old man who once made him a pair of shoes before Danny was even born, shoes his mother had kept, had shown him, had told him, if you're ever afraid, and you can't find me, go to the mountain. He'd worn those shoes until one fell apart on the road. Ezra sat very still when he heard all of this, hands folded so tight his knuckles ached. 15 years of silence. 15 years of two stubborn men refusing to bend. And here, in the wreckage of all that pride, was a 6-year-old boy who'd walked 2 days through the cold because a mountain was safer than his own father's house. The knock came the following evening. Not soft, like the first one. Hard. Angry. 3 heavy strikes that rattled the door in its frame. The dogs erupted into barking. Danny, sitting by the fire, went white as bone and dropped the wooden horse Ezra had carved him that afternoon. Get in the back room, Ezra said, voice low and steady in a way that surprised even him. Now. Danny didn't move. Just stared at the door, frozen the way prey freezes. Danny. Ezra crouched to his level, gripped his small shoulders gently but firmly. Look at me. Nobody is taking you off this mountain. You hear me? Nobody. The boy's eyes, wet and terrified, finally met his. Promise? Ezra thought of every promise he'd broken in his life. Every door he'd shut. Every chance at family he'd let freeze over out of pride and grief and stubborn, mountain-hard silence. I promise, he said. And for the first time in 15 years, he meant a promise with everything he had left. The knock came again, harder. A voice followed it, rough, impatient, chillingly familiar even after all these years. Open the door, old man. I know he's in there. Ezra rose slowly, rifle in hand, and walked toward the door. His own son was standing on the other side of it. Ezra opened the door. The wind hit first, sharp, biting, carrying snow that hadn't started falling yet but promised to before morning. And then he saw him. Danny Colton. His son. Older now, harder around the eyes than Ezra remembered, a rough beard covering a jaw that used to belong to a boy who'd once cried in this very cabin over a broken fishing rod. 15 years had worn grooves into his face that hadn't been there before. Whiskey on his breath, sharp enough to smell from the doorway. Neither man spoke for a long moment. The wind filled the silence between them, the way it always had. Where is he? Danny said. Not a question. A demand. Ezra didn't move from the doorway. Warm yourself by the fire first. Man's got a right to that much, even a man I haven't seen in 15 years. Don't. Danny's voice cracked, anger and something rawer underneath it. Don't you dare stand there acting like the reasonable one. Not after everything. I'm not acting like anything, Ezra said quietly. I'm asking my son to come in out of the cold. Something in Danny's jaw tightened, like the word son had hit somewhere unguarded. He stepped inside anyway, boots heavy on the old floorboards, eyes scanning the cabin until they landed on the boy standing frozen by the fire. Danny. His voice softened, just slightly, reaching for the boy. Come on. We're going home. The boy didn't move. His hand found the back of Ezra's shirt again, gripping tight. He doesn't want to go, Ezra said. He's 6. What he wants isn't the question. Danny's eyes cut to his father, hard and bright with old fury. This isn't your business, old man. You gave up any say in my life the day you told me I wasn't tough enough to run this ridge. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. Ezra felt them land, felt 15 years of that sentence sitting in his chest like a stone he'd never set down. I said a lot of things I had no right saying, Ezra said slowly. Things I've regretted every day since you walked off this mountain. Danny laughed, short and bitter. Now you regret it. I regretted it the night you left. I just didn't know how to say so. For a moment, something flickered behind Danny's eyes, the ghost of the boy he used to be, the boy who'd once looked up to this hard old man before hardness became the only language either of them knew how to speak. Then it hardened over again, quick as ice forming. Save it, he said. Danny. Now. The boy's grip on Ezra's shirt tightened. He looked up, not at his father, but at Ezra, silently begging. Ezra knelt down slowly, joints protesting, and looked the boy in the eye. You don't have to be afraid, he said softly. Whatever happens, I'm right here. Then he stood, and turned to face his son fully, for the first time in 15 years standing like a man who had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. He told me things, Danny, Ezra said quietly. About what it's like at your house. About why he ran 2 days through the cold to get here instead of calling anybody closer. Danny's face went pale, then flushed dark with something between shame and rage. That's not, he doesn't understand things the way. He understands fear, Ezra cut in, voice steady but not unkind. Same as you did, once. Same as I taught you to feel, if I'm honest with myself. I was hard on you, boy. Too hard. I see that now, sitting in this cabin 15 years too late to fix it. Danny's hands curled into fists at his sides. For a moment, Ezra thought he might swing. He'd seen that same coiled violence in his son's shoulders once before, the night Danny left. Instead, his son's fist slowly opened. And something in his face crumbled, the anger sliding off to reveal something underneath it, something exhausted and frightened and very young. I don't know how to do this, Danny whispered. Being a father. Nobody ever showed me how. The fire cracked in the silence that followed. Ezra felt the weight of every year between them settle onto his shoulders, not as blame, but as understanding. He had been the first crack in this chain. His hardness had taught his son hardness, and his son's hardness had frightened a small boy onto a mountain road in the cold. No, Ezra agreed quietly. Nobody showed either of us. That's on me, more than anybody. Danny's eyes were wet now, in the firelight, in a way Ezra hadn't seen since his son was young enough to cry without shame. I don't want to be like you, Danny said, voice breaking. The man I became. I don't want him to grow up scared of me, same as I was scared of. He stopped himself. But the words hung there anyway, finished or not. Ezra stepped closer, slow, the way he'd approach a spooked animal, or a frightened man who'd once been his boy. Then don't leave him with me for 15 years to fix what you broke, Ezra said gently. Stay. Both of you. Let an old man try to make right what he got wrong the first time. Danny didn't answer that night. He sat by the fire until the flames burned low, watching his son sleep in the bed that had once been his own, saying nothing, working through something too large for words. By morning, the anger had drained out of him, leaving behind something quieter. Something that looked almost like relief. He stayed 3 days. Then a week. Then, without either man ever quite deciding it out loud, he simply didn't leave. Spring came slow to the mountain that year, the way it always did, frost giving way to mud, mud giving way to green, the creek behind the cabin swelling loud with snowmelt. Ezra taught his son how to mend a fence again, the way he had 30 years before. This time, neither man raised his voice. Danny taught his own son how to fish in the creek, patient in a way his father had never quite managed to be with him, patient in the way only a man who has feared becoming his own father can learn to be. And in the evenings, when the light went golden low across the ridge, 3 generations of Coltons sat together on the porch Ezra had built with his own 2 hands, decades ago, back when he still believed family was something you had to be strong enough to deserve. He knew better now. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the tree line and the first cool breath of dusk moved through the pines, Danny, the boy, ran across the yard chasing one of the dogs, laughter carrying clear across the open field, bright and unafraid in a way it hadn't been that first frozen night on the porch. Ezra watched him from his rocking chair, a second chair creaking gently beside his own, his son settling into it with a tired, easy sigh. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to. Behind them, hanging just inside the cabin door where Ezra had placed it that morning, a small pair of hand-stitched shoes rested beside a fresh pair he'd made to replace them, old and new, side by side, exactly the way a family was supposed to be.